take a position of nature, and whenever you take a position of nature, immediately depolitization ensues. This is why the position of nature has been invented. It has actually made for that. That is, when you take a position of nature, you indifferentiate all of the other interests, and that's what gives so much weight to the argument. So we try to reverse, which of course means that when you repoliticize nature, we enter in all of those debates. I mean, who do you represent? What is your legitimacy? Where is your authority coming from? All the classical questions is back. But what cannot be done is to say, well, I'm just talking about the framework in which you all are, the background, as if you were yourself removed from a background, and all of the others is just political science. So that's the first lesson which I try to convey. Second one, even though we didn't have much time to get into it, is inclusion of the sciences. And we heard very little of that, except when we talk about earthworms, and where's the soil coming from, where's the acidification of the ocean coming from. I mean, all of those questions have to be developed a lot in the real simulation of May, I mean, the real one. Because, of course, it's only when you insert the voice-making mechanism of the sciences that you begin to solve, in some ways, the question of in the name of whom do you speak. So it's because the sciences are so important in making their voice heard that all those phenomena about soil, climate, ocean, territories is made visible. So to put the sciences in the process, I mean to make them, to foreground the process of science is of course the second lesson that we have learned, and many examples. But remember this thing I presented at the beginning, where the way the science itself is being produced is so important. And here you see this famous site in New Zealand where the CO2 is actually the very simple observation point, but every day you have to be there with an empty glass, suck a little bit of air, and this is how you calculate the CO2 emission throughout the planet. And it's only because you foreground the science that you begin to pay attention to all these mechanisms that make something like CO2 quantity is made visible through those sort of instrumentation, even though sometimes they are very, very simple. And of course, this position, and that's of course the difficulty we had with the soil question, is that this position where you put the science is extremely important. You put the science as anywhere, that is a view from nowhere, like when it was alluded to the three laws of thermodynamics, or do you situate it into a specific place, basically, laboratories, instruments, networks, and we saw that when we studied Paul Edwards' a vast machine. And it's very difficult actually to locate the vast machine and to foreground the vast machine which is responsible for this mechanism. So it's very difficult to get into all those questions without the sciences being foreground. And of course I don't know how we are going to do that, because the GIEC, the IPCC, is everywhere in every delegation. And this is why we put in every delegation a science delegation, one of the science delegations. So that the voice by which the knowledge is produced is foregrounded and made explicit. This is an important point. If we want to have a sort of grand narrative of a class, I think it's summarized by these two slogans. One of them is the emancipation move, the plus ultra, which is, as you know, the slogan of a motto of the Spanish Empire, crossing the Hercule column in the 15th century. And there is something which is always behind this politicization of nature, which is something around intra, very different idea of emancipation, but as Sloterdijk, I will show a few things from Sloterdijk, we call explicitation. And of course, it's one of the great difficulties which explain a large part of climate skepticism on which we spend a lot of time. We are still in a narrative of emancipation, and suddenly all of these guys talking about ocean, talking about air or soil, are talking about limits. And we have no way to reconcile our emancipation narrative with the notion of limit. We try décroissance, asceticism, développement durable. We know that it's very difficult to articulate. Basically, there's a clash between two narratives which have no real connection, plus intra and plus intra. Sloterdijk, I'd like to finish with Sloterdijk because we had no time to speak a lot about him, has a very nice expression about explicitation. But what happened to us, us humans, but also us earthworms, us ocean, us everything, is that we have to be explicitated. Which means that our presence has to be made visible through some sort of operation coming from science, but also from the art and from politics. Explicitation, and the metaphor is of course here, not this is not coming from gravity, but from the space station, where when you do a space station you have to explicitate every single element of survival. If not, the thing blows up, like in gravity. So the explicitation of condition of life are, for Sloterdijk, the effect, in a way, of what we call here ecological mutation. So it means that every single thing we were taken for granted are no longer taken for granted. Basically, the coming on the fore, on stage of all these non-human delegations is simply that. We have to make explicit, to render explicit what was before taken for granted. Exactly the same way as when you are, the example he gives in the space station is that when cosmonauts started to sleep out of space, they actually realized that they intoxicated themselves by the CO2 that remained close to their mouth. So they were dying, they risked dying from just the CO2 accumulated. So they had to add a ventilator to spread the CO2, and then it was recycled. Well, that's what explicitation is about. The example that Sloterdijk gives in these two very important books, the first one is of course the most important one, probably the one in the middle, the globe, is that history is, quote, history is that of explicitation and not of revolution. So it's a different movement. This is why I asked the question about time. It's not a movement that you are in a situation when you revolve, or you have sort of revolution about this condition. It's that everything which was taken for granted is now rendered in a long list of explicitation and slowly coming to the foreground. We are not from a ground to another ground. We are from a ground where everything was taken for granted to a ground where you have to make the long list of explicitation clear. This is actually in the first volume, but I have no time to get into all of the things. But the metaphor that he has is that of Biosphere 2, which you probably know is very strange program in Arizona in the 80s of building a sort of glass house, a big glass house, where you would have reconstructed all of the conditions of existence. Biosphere 1 being the Earth, Biosphere 2 being this thing. It was a disaster, it never worked, but it's a metaphor that is important for Sloterdijk, that with Earth 1 is like Earth 2, that is, you have to make absolutely clear the conflict and explicitation of every single entity to understand why it fails. So it's a failure of Biosphere 2, which does exist, by the way, which is so important for understanding Biosphere 1. And the metaphor that used to make people understand explicitation is the gas war, 1977, for us 1917, where you get the gas coming to the trenches in the war, First World War. Not cigarette smoke, something which actually you die from. It is, by the way, from a fabulous BD on Fritz Haber, the great chemist who invented those systems. Got the Nobel Prize. Fritz Haber, as you know, and is also responsible for cyclone B. So when you get the gas coming, something you were taking for granted, air, you lose it. And Sloterdijk, an account of the ecological mutation is that what happened to the air is happening to everything. Earthworm, climate, fishes, all the things we try to represent, oceans, everything which was taken for granted appear now as something you could lose and then enter into your field of consciousness, so to speak. This is the, 1915. Ypres. This is a terrifying passage in the book by Sloterdijk. You see the cloud of air, and suddenly you realize that air whatever happened in war, you thought that air was actually there for you to breathe, and suddenly air is missing. So the metaphor that Sloterdijk uses is that in ecological crisis we are always constantly doing it. We lose possibility. And then of course you equip yourself and make the air explicit by having gas masks, etc. That's a metaphor. Fourth point, on which we spend a lot of time, the global. Globe is the enemy of politics. And here we spend a lot of time using many different resources, but this is an important aspect, that there is a sort of paradoxical connection between the notion of a globe, which is actually a theological notion, as Sloterdijk demonstrates, and the idea that when you have to think about the Earth and Gaia, you always have to think about the global. But the point of the global is too much for us. There is no politics of the global. It's impossible. The global doesn't allow all this differentiation we just witnessed in the discussion before. And as Sloterdijk has shown again in the volume 2, a very interesting passage where he compared the obsession for the sphere coming from theology, the old idea of the Earth as a sort of orbis terrarum, or orbis larum in this case, mixed with images of the Earth. And actually there's a book on that and by a French historian of science, which is very interesting on the sort of fusion of the metaphor, theological metaphor, on top of the scientific instrument. So the blue planet, yes, it's very important, the blue planet, but it unifies much too fast. And what this book by Gremisch shows, as well as Sloterdijk, is that in fact the blue planet was so powerful because it fitted with a theological prototype that was in fact the source of the absolute obsession for the globe. And of course, to be in the globe means that you are God. So, strangely enough, if you want to depoliticize the question, you take it globally. Immediately it's depoliticized. And for a reason that Sloterdijk has showed very beautifully, is that when you see the globe, it's always because you are seeing it from there, or from the moon, or from the point of view of nowhere. So it's a very nice case where the very idea that questions are global, depoliticize them immediately because they put you in the position of maximum indifference, which is occupying the position of God and looking from far away to the position of the Earth. This image, by the way, is very strange in the Louvre. Remember? Okay, so great narrative moment. Fifth point. That's the positive part of my class, which had no positive class, very much positive, I'm sorry to say. But the positive fact is that in the same way as the age of discoveries modified and forces to modify everything, including music, theater, science, of course, political theory, religion, and everything, we are, in a way, in a new age of great discovery. And here you have the tomb of Christopher Columbus. And you remember those old maps that we had before the discovery, what is called Great Discovery. Of course, this is a pre-post-colonial term. but we still use it, great discoveries, the age of great discoveries. Even all the people who were discovered actually were already there, but it's an old term. So there is this very great difficulty of accommodating the new world with the old map, called the T map, like this one here. And of course we invented all sorts of mapping systems in order to describe the territories coming to us. Well, we are in the same situation. Except now it's this situation here, as we saw many times preparing for this simulation, which is the old T map. You know, we try to locate the new territories inside the traditional territories, just like the medieval people using the T maps, trying to map, bring all the new territory, especially like the discovery of America. So we're exactly in the same situation. We try to bring inside the Westphalian state the discovery of all these new entities that we are trying to represent here. This is why it's so difficult. So you see why the metaphor of a T-map is so good. I mean, how could you meet all of those new things inside this, where Jerusalem is in the middle, and where the whole idea of a T-map is that it's a symbolic order? What do you do with America? There's no place in that ceremony. They tried. Say Indians are the lost tribe of Israel, which probably have made a long movement, but they didn't know how to do it. Well, we are in the same position, except with this big difference, that it's not an extension of new territory that has been found. We are not discovering new land. We are discovering new reactions of the old land, new soil precisely. That's where the soil, coming back of the notion of soil everywhere in politics is so interesting. By the way, you know that the year of the soil this year. You know that soil, the soil getting it. So it's not by coincidence that soil comes back. It's very interesting. What's happening? Well, it's a new discovery, but it's a discovery not of the earth, of new land in addition to the land we have. It's a discovery of land beneath of the land we had before. That is another way for the land to react. We realize that climate was already there, but not in the same way. The earth were there, but not with earthworms. Rivers were there, but not the same, and so on and so forth. So it is important because what had happened, what is happening to us had happened before. That is, our predecessors in the 16th century had to absorb the complete strangeness of all these new lands for which there was no precedent. And that's what makes all of this question of ecology, art, politics, religion, and science so interesting now. But it's exactly the same point. Completely different ways of being on an earth, on land. Except, of course, it's slightly easier to add land to the land which exists than to modify on the land which already exists another way of being on those lands. And this is why every time we talk about lobbies, transnational entities, cross-cutting entities, we don't know how to represent them. It's not just cartography, or it's a cartography which is very, very different. 6. This is probably what is most bizarre in terms of our sort of position on Earth. It's this notion that space has somewhat shrunk. So we are no longer in nature, we are in something which is, we call Gaia, the pellicular Gaia, a situation where we are back to where we were before in the 16th century. Sublunar is the word. And you remember what Lovelock's discovery is. Lovelock discovered suddenly that you could look at the world as not the Galilean world of infinite space, but shrinking. It is as bizarre for modernizers as it is to have suddenly realized that you are not in the plus ultra, but in the plus intra situation. Suddenly, the space, and actually the representative from the soil mentioned that it's a pellicule, it's a small zone. It's It's not infinite of space. And 7, and probably the last one, is that this is why we have to do the simulation, is that there is no arbiter. That's why we are at war. If there is an arbiter, and that's the Schmittian point that we discussed 3 weeks ago, if there is an arbiter, there is no real war. It's just a question of distributing roles. And of course we heard a little bit about when the ocean actually says we have the authority and you have, or when the soil says we are lording over you. Hegemony is of course one possibility, but you say there is an arbiter, Gaia, the earth, nature, and it's deciding or distributing position. And as we saw when we studied the COP principle itself, there is that in the COP, this idea that if only all of the nations were getting together, they would be under an authority which would have the power to distribute roles in a very specific and particular case, distribute CO2 emissions quota, so to speak. Of course, if there were a state of nature, a state, capital S, of nature, capital N, you could say, well, it's the same as distributing subsidies between, I don't know, California and Arizona, the states which can do that. So we will distribute gold between Indonesia, India, America. This state does not exist. So any position that supposes or implies that you speak in the name of this arbiter is actually a lie, and actually depoliticize the position. And I'm sorry to say that the Secretariat, but even the Secretariat, is not a position of arbiter. They are in a position of facilitator. Even Remy does not represent, nor Alice, nor Karen represent the stakeholder. They represent they facilitate the non-existing arbiter to build a very uncertain space for coalitions and negotiation to take place. And that's where really the lesson of the simulation of May. Is there an alternative to the notion of world order, which is not based on the appeal to a sort of commonality, but which is a modus vivendi, in the literal sense of the word, an arrangement between conflicting territories, where no one can hope to obtain agreement simply by saying, like you did so beautifully, you are me and you will all die if you don't follow my rules. Or in our play, with Frederick, we did a play where Gaia says, you can't make a distinction between you and me. This will depoliticize the question, but of course it will put those who say that again in the position of God. And God is never a great way to politicize. So the question is, are we able to build the instrument to repoliticize seriously this question? Ecology, basically, since it started in the 19th century, has been an instrument of depoliticization. And that's why it never goes anywhere. Because it always says that since we agree, because it's nature, we don't need war and peace. And that's a key point that we try to, not to solve, but to constantly. But of course, it's very nice to have an arbiter. And then we did, remember, we made a little experiment, which I think was the most important one in the class. Are your enemies irrational? Or are they enemies? This is the Schmittian question. If they are irrational, you are not at war. You are simply wiping out irrational people from the face of the earth. And that's called a police operation. It's great if you have a police and the army behind you. But the point that it's a depolitization of the whole situation. But if you are fighting enemies, in the Schmittian sense, it means that those who oppose you might actually also destroy your values, which means you are uncertain about your values. So you see why it's so different, why it's so important in ecology, because the tenor of ecological debate is that one position occupies the upper moral and scientific ground, nature, open a space of necessary agreement, and it's very surprised to see that there are still a few irrational people who disagree. And what do you do with people who disagree? Well, either you shoot them, or you just ignore them. But the problem is that when you have one group who does no politics against a group who does politics, it's the group who does politics who always win. This is, of course, a great quote from Schmitt. If you don't bother about politics, remember the quote, I mean, let's take the burden of having a politics. This is a very powerful statement of Schmitt. Now, conclusion, 8, we don't have the institution to do that, and this is why we have to do the simulation ourselves. This is one of the many meetings. So we have to invent, and that's what has been so courageously taken by our friend here and many of you. That's what we are looking for. New nomos of the earth, to use Carl Schmitt. Well, I think we have been at the end of this class, and we did a little simulation. It was very kind of you, some of you, to do it. Thank you for earthworms and many others. And we will all meet again for the whole week of May, the end of May, from the 27th to the 28th to the 31st. We will have great pleasure of having some of the people from SPIP, 2 of them are here. SPIP is a political art school who are very actively helping the secretariat. And we have great privilege to have several people from the secretariat. We have a group of observers who will decode, and here is Clémence, who will decode the experience for us, so that at the end of the 31st of May, when we have a mega tough, after the mega tough, I don't know if it's a mega tough, we will be able to know what we have learned from the experiences. Thank you all, and thank you for